Why do some records stay with us for a lifetime? Sometimes it isn't just the song itself. Sometimes it's the remix. Sometimes it's the sound. And sometimes it's the place where we first heard it. For me, François Kevorkian's remix of Yazoo's Situation became all three. Before we come back to my own story, we first need to go back to the song itself. When Yazoo released their debut single in March 1982, Situation quietly appeared on the B-side. It wasn't expected to become one of the duo's defining recordings. In fact, the song was written at the last minute after Vince Clarke decided that another track originally intended for the B-side deserved to become a future single instead. Recorded at Blackwing Studios in London, Situation perfectly captured what made Yazoo so distinctive. Clarke's gift for writing memorable synthesizer melodies and creating unique electronic sounds blended effortlessly with Alison Moyet's rich, soulful voice. It was a combination that sounded fresh, confident, and unlike almost anything else being released at the time. From the very first listen, one particular moment stayed with me. The opening synthesizer melody. It's remarkably simple, yet instantly recognizable. A bright, delayed lead line that immediately draws you into the song. It doesn't rely on complexity or technical wizardry. Instead, it demonstrates just how powerful a perfectly crafted melody can be. That melody never changed. When I first heard François Kevorkian's remix, it was those very same opening notes that immediately told me I was listening to Situation. The melody, the familiar synthesizer sounds, and much of the arrangement remained exactly as I remembered them. What François Kevorkian changed was the production. The mix had greater clarity, more space, and considerably more punch. With just a few carefully chosen additions, he transformed the listening experience while preserving everything that made the original so special. By the summer of 1982, Situation had attracted the attention of Sire Records in the United States. The label believed the song had the potential to become a major success and decided to commission a remix for the American market. At the time, the idea of handing a finished recording to an outside remixer was still unfamiliar to Mute Records. Daniel Miller later admitted that they were initially very protective of their recordings and unsure about letting someone else reinterpret their work. Vince Clarke also recalled that he didn't particularly like the remix at first because it moved away from what they had originally recorded. Years later, he laughed that this was, of course, exactly what a remix was supposed to do. Looking back today, I think Kevorkian understood something very important. He recognized that Situation didn't need reinventing. The unforgettable opening melody remained. The familiar synthesizer sounds were still there. Much of the original arrangement was left untouched. Instead of rebuilding the song, he refined it. The mix became clearer, the rhythm section more powerful, and every important musical element was given more room to breathe. That's what makes this remix so remarkable. It never loses sight of the original recording. Instead, it reveals just how good that original recording already was. By the early 1980s, Kevorkian had become one of New York's most respected DJs and remix engineers. Originally from France, he had immersed himself in the city's club scene, where he developed a reputation for creating mixes that weren't simply longer versions of existing songs, but records that felt more exciting, more dynamic, and more powerful on a dance floor. Unlike many producers, Kevorkian didn't separate the studio from the club. He regularly tested his mixes on some of New York's finest sound systems before returning to the studio to make further adjustments. That gave him a unique understanding of how production choices affected not only what people heard, but what they actually felt. His philosophy was surprisingly simple. A remix shouldn't lose the identity of the original recording. It should reveal its strengths. That's exactly what happened with Situation. Rather than replacing Vince Clarke's programming or Alison Moyet's vocal performance, Kevorkian refined what was already there. He opened up the mix, strengthened the groove, and allowed every important musical element to occupy its own space. The song remained unmistakably Situation, but it now possessed a clarity and physical impact that made perfect sense on a large club sound system. Looking back today, it's easy to understand why this remix became such a success. François Kevorkian wasn't trying to make the song different. He was trying to make people experience it differently. The most impressive thing about François Kevorkian's remix is how little he needed to change. The original recording already contained everything that made Situation distinctive. Vince Clarke's delayed lead melody, the bass sequence, Alison Moyet's commanding vocal and the sharply programmed electronic rhythms were all preserved. Kevorkian understood that these were not problems to be solved. They were the foundations on which the remix had to be built. His changes were carefully judged. Additional percussion gave the rhythm greater movement, while a small number of new synthesizer parts, including a brief new melody, added color without crowding the arrangement. The extended structure also gave the track more time to establish its groove and made it better suited to DJs and the dance floor. But the greatest transformation came from the mix itself. The sounds were spread more widely and given clearer positions. Individual parts did not compete for attention. The bass and drums carried greater weight. The percussion had more definition. And the delayed opening melody stood out with remarkable clarity. Nothing felt wasted, and nothing felt added simply to fill the available space. Listening to it today, I hear a principle that would later become increasingly important in my own production work. A powerful arrangement does not necessarily require more sounds. Sometimes it requires fewer sounds, carefully chosen and allowed to work together as a whole. Less is more. Kevorkian did not change the identity of Situation. He changed its dynamics, its clarity, and its physical impact. The result felt fresher, more immediate, and more alive, especially through a powerful club sound system. For me, the story of this remix is inseparable from the place where I first heard it. Club Nice, named after the French city, stood in one of the rougher parts of Copenhagen, next to the headquarters of a notorious motorcycle gang. Inside, however, it felt like entering another world. The club was built almost like the interior of a church, with one large central room and balconies running around the dance floor, where people could sit and look down at those dancing below. The room was dark, and as far as I remember, with simple red and blue lighting, but the atmosphere was always electric. This was not a place where people gathered around the DJ booth and watched someone perform. The DJ was barely visible. The focus was entirely on the music, the dance floor, and the connection between the people in the room. At the time, there were really only 2 clubs in Copenhagen where my friends and I could hear new wave, synthpop, and new romantic music. The other was Daddy's Dance Hall, where I had been sneaking in since I was 16, because most of my friends were already 18. Eventually, the bouncer caught me, and we began going to Nice instead. In retrospect, that was probably a good thing. Daddy's played more of the familiar hits, while Nice went deeper. The DJs played British imports, extended remixes, B-sides and more adventurous records that rarely reached the mainstream. It introduced me to unfamiliar artists and revealed other sides of bands I already loved. The club became more than somewhere to spend a Friday or Saturday night. It became part of my musical education, a place where records could surprise me and familiar songs could suddenly take on a completely different life. And it was there, sometime around 1983, that the opening notes of Situation emerged from the sound system. I recognized the melody immediately, but this time it sounded clearer, stronger, and more alive than I had ever heard it before. What made the experience so powerful was not only the remix itself, but the sound system through which I heard it. On a small home stereo, you listen to a record from a distance. On a nightclub dance floor, the music surrounds you. The bass is no longer simply a sound coming from a pair of speakers. You feel it in your chest and through the floor, while the drums create a physical pulse that moves through the room. Research into large sound systems has shown how strongly our impression of sound quality is shaped by the clarity and impact of the low frequencies. When the bass is powerful but controlled, the music feels more immediate and more exciting. That was exactly how Situation sounded at Club Nice. The rhythm had weight, but it was never muddy, and the clarity of the synthesizers remained intact above it. That balance was what made the remix so effective. The bass and drums gave the track its physical force, while the open production allowed Vince Clarke's programming to remain sharply defined. The delayed lead melody seemed to stretch across the room, every repetition clear and distinct. I'm certain it would not have affected me in quite the same way if I had first heard it at home. The remix was designed for the dance floor, and on a powerful club system, it became more than something you listened to. It became something you experienced. As I became more serious about collecting records, I gradually realized that many of those early 1980s 12-inch singles offered something special. At the time, I didn't understand why. I simply knew they sounded different. The bass seemed deeper, the drums had more punch, and every instrument felt clearer and more defined. Years later, I discovered there were good reasons for that. Unlike a full-length album, a 12-inch single usually contained only 1 or 2 tracks on each side. That gave mastering engineers far more room to work, allowing them to cut the record louder, preserve more dynamics, and give the bass greater impact. Many were also mastered at 45 RPM, improving clarity and detail even further. But perhaps the most important reason was that these records were made for clubs. The mixes, the mastering, and the cutting were all designed to sound their best on powerful sound systems, where the music wasn't just heard, it was felt. Of course, not every 12-inch sounded better. The quality always depended on the recording, the remix, and the mastering. But when everything came together, the results could be extraordinary. Looking back, I finally understood why that remix of Situation had made such an impression on me all those years ago. It wasn't just a great remix, it was a great sounding record. At the time, I would not have called myself a musician. I owned a Korg Poly 61 synthesizer and a small 5-track tape recorder, and I was slowly teaching myself how to play, program sounds, and recording music. I was not yet analyzing records in the way I would later as a producer. I was simply trying to understand how artists such as Yazoo and Depeche Mode created the sounds that fascinated me. My instinct was to search for the right sound rather than simply place one synthesizer part on top of another. I cannot say that Situation alone shaped the way I would eventually produce music. Many artists and recordings contributed to that, but hearing productions like this gradually taught me to notice clarity, separation, and the importance of giving each sound a purpose. Those ideas became more conscious as I gained experience. A production does not always become more powerful by adding another layer. Sometimes the strongest choice is to remove something, create more space, and allow the sounds that matter to stand out. In that sense, the lesson at the heart of François Kevorkian's remix is remarkably simple. Less is more.